Is adultery the only biblical grounds for divorce? Hi, welcome to today's little lesson, and thank you so very much for joining me once again on my back porch. On today's little lesson, we want to address, and at least begin to address, a question sent to us by one of our beloved viewers, a question about divorce and what are the legitimate biblical grounds for divorce. Is it only adultery? And the reason that this viewer asked this question, she's a woman, and her husband has not committed adultery, but he has been making their lives miserable on a number of levels for a long time. And it just doesn't look like there's any hope for any harmony. And so she's wondering, can I only divorce my husband if I catch him in the act of adultery? All right, well, this is a great question. And I realize that potentially I'll be opening up a can of worms, but, let's look at the scripture and use the brains that God has given us. Now, let me start off by saying that everyone who enters into marriage, anyone who marries is thinking this is till death do us part. That's what they say in their vows. They're not planning on getting divorced. They have every hope and aspiration for marital bliss. Right. And in most cases, people are not creeps. If they run into trouble in their marriage, if there's disharmony, they try to work it out together. And oftentimes they succeed. What marriage hasn't had some conflict, right? It's very rare to find a marriage that's never had any conflict. And so married couples realize we're committed to each other, and so they do their best to work it out, to reach a compromise, to reach an understanding, and to move on from that conflict. If they're not able to on their own, then oftentimes one or the other, or hopefully both, will agree to marriage counseling. And so they're looking for another party to enter into and to give them insight and wisdom to help them work through it. So what I'm saying is they start off with the best of intentions. They fight for their marriage. They, do admirably in attempting to keep their marriage from falling apart, because nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. Everyone who's married wants to have marital bliss. Now, there are some creepy people who, find somebody who's more attractive to them and they have an affair and so forth. And so it's not, the problem is not that they have conflict in their marriage. It's that, they lack the self-control and let themselves be carried away by somebody else and have an affair and so forth. And so that's a little bit different. But what I'm talking about in most marriages where people get married for the best of intentions and do their best to stay together, but sometimes they reach a place where divorce actually becomes a thought. And this person who has written to me, that's where they're at. But their spouse, their husband, has not committed adultery as far as they know. That being said, they are aware that her husband, has indulged in pornography. And with some degree of regularity. She doesn't know, how much he's indulging, but she's caught him several times and he makes excuses. Well, that's very demeaning to any wife who catches her husband staring at some other women, who are unclothed or half naked or whatever. And Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery in his heart, so that's what's going on mentally. And so she hasn't caught him in adultery, but she's saying, hey, I've kind of caught him in mental adultery. And there's other problems besides that. This is not just one little incident or a string of incidents. That's just a component of all the misery. Okay. Well, most times when this subject is discussed, there's a verse in the 19th chapter of Matthew that is brought up as relevant. And I'd agree, it is relevant. Let's read that verse, because from this verse is derived the idea that the only legitimate grounds for divorce is adultery. And we're kind of breaking into the middle of a story, Jesus talking to some Pharisees, but this is what's often done. Things are read out of their context. But here Jesus says in Matthew 19 and verse number 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And so it seems to say that the only legitimate reason that a man could divorce his wife is immorality. The word in the Greek is porneia, of course, where we get our English word pornography. But the best interpretation or translation of porneia is sexual immorality. It's often translated as fornication, which has a specific meaning, in English. But the best translation is sexual immorality. So it's more of a general term of any kind of sexual immorality. And so if a husband catches his wife in sexual immorality, then that's, legitimate grounds for divorce. And if he does marry another, he doesn't commit adultery. But implied here, if he divorces her for any reason other than sexual immorality and he marries another, then he commits adultery. Okay, so it seems pretty plain, but, may I point out, first of all, that there's nothing there about a wife divorcing her husband. It's only talking about the husband divorcing a wife. And within the context of the Mosaic law, that's about all you get. You don't find anything that really allows a woman to divorce her husband, with it one exception, which I will point that out before we finish this. But here he's talking about a man divorcing his wife, and she has to be guilty of sexual immorality for that to be legitimate. Well, in our thinking, and I can't see any reason to fault this thinking, if men can divorce their wives for sexual immorality, then why couldn't a wife divorce her husband for the same thing, right? Right. And in fact, in Mark's gospel, where Mark is recounting the same story, the same historical setting, the time in Jesus' ministry, he actually brings that thought up, which is quite interesting. I'm reading now from Mark 10 and verse number 10. Jesus said, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. There's no exception there except for immorality. Mark didn't include that. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. So apparently, Mark, in his writing, decided to include the equity of women having the same right or non-right as men when it came to divorce. Okay. In both of these cases, which we've just mentioned, they're in Matthew 19 and in Mark 10. They're both the exact same setting where some Pharisees came up to Jesus to test him, asking him a question related to all this, which led up to what we just read. So these statements by Jesus were not said in a vacuum. They were not just, thrown in as a proverb in a list of proverbs, and all truth is encapsulated in this one sentence, and context has no bearing whatsoever. No, like everything in the Bible, context is everything. We need to read every statement within its biblical and its historical, which is also a biblical context. And thankfully, there is some context here. Why don't we read it and see if we get some insight into what Jesus is actually saying? So, starting in Matthew chapter 19 and verse number 3, some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? Oh my goodness, what a loaded question. And if you didn't know some of the historical background for that, you're going to be at somewhat of a loss as to answer the question, why did they even ask such a crazy question as that? And the answer is that they were asking Jesus a question that had been hotly debated amongst Israel's rabbis and even amongst the Pharisees themselves for decades on, what constitutes a legitimate reason for divorce. And there were two primary schools of thought that, weighed in on that very question. And it was all based upon the fact that everyone who read the Old Testament, the law of Moses, knew that God permitted divorce. It's irrefutable. Deuteronomy chapter 24, the first 3 verses address, for example, a woman who gets divorced and remarried, and then her second husband divorces her or he dies, and it prohibits her from remarrying the original husband, the first guy. And that says that that's actually an abomination of the Lord. But it's very clear that, God was not prohibiting divorce. In fact, it says, let me read it to you here from Deuteronomy 24. When a man takes a wife and he marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes. Now, some of the rabbis honed in on that right there. Oh, well, there you go. The legitimate reason for divorce is that she finds no favor in his eyes. So it's, very arbitrary. It's very subjective. If the man thinks, oh, well, you're not finding any favor in my eyes any longer, well, then I have legitimate reason to divorce you. But it goes on to say, because he has found some indecency in her. And so there was debate on what constitutes an indecency by which a man could divorce his wife. And the two primary schools of thought in Jesus' day were found in 2 rabbinic schools. One was the school of Hillel, Hillel, and the other was in the school of Shammai, Shammai, Shamai, I think it was, something like that. And the Hillel was the liberal one, and Shammai was the conservative one. He said that, the only indecency that possibly Moses could have been referring to there was some sexual indecency, something, extremely grievous. Whereas Hillel said, oh, no, he doesn't find favor in her eyes. So one translation says he's not pleasing to her. So anything that a wife does that's not pleasing to her husband is legitimate grounds for divorce. And he actually specified if he burns her food as he's cooking her dinner, that's legitimate grounds. Another rabbi who's on kind of the same train of thought that Hillel was, said that if a husband sees a woman who's more beautiful than his wife, then his wife has not found favor in his eyes. His wife has become indecent in his eyes, and he can then legitimately divorce her for that reason. Well, I know what you're thinking. It's the same thing I'm thinking. That's crazy. Making divorce so ridiculously easy, and for such an excuse as my wife burned my food, or I saw a woman who was more attractive than my wife, that's ridiculous. And of course, that's exactly what Jesus thought, as any decent person would think. And so Jesus reminds the Pharisees who are asking him this question, which was a contemporary question of the day, hotly debated. And of course, most of the Pharisees sided with Hillel, the liberal. And so for that reason, divorce and remarriage was rampant, as you know it would be when you make it so easy and anyone can get a divorce for this host of ridiculous reasons. And so Jesus reminds them of the Bible, takes them back to the beginning. And you know what he said. He answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He's just quoting from Genesis there. And so he said, now commentating, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So basically what Jesus is saying is God never intended for anyone to get divorced. It's supposed to be joining together, and it is a joining together by God in a covenant before God. And so there shouldn't be separation. There shouldn't be divorce. So God is against divorce in general. Now that is not the sum total of everything that the Bible talks about on this subject, obviously. And in fact, the Pharisees are going to bring up an objection right away because they know that the law of Moses permitted divorce for at least an indecency. And if they really knew the scripture, which I suspect they did, they could have read a passage in Exodus chapter 21, which if we have time, I'll read it to you, but allowed a woman to essentially walk away from a marriage if her husband took another woman into so he became a polygamist, and that didn't give her the right to leave. But if he withheld from her conjugal rights, so therefore she's not getting sex any longer, if he's not providing food and clothing for this woman, she can walk away and go back home to her dad. That's in the law. That's in Exodus chapter 21. Okay, so everyone who was talking to Jesus that day knew all those things. And so Jesus is coming very strong on God's opposed to divorce, and then they naturally bring up, well, how come Moses allowed it? And so they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? They're actually misquoting Deuteronomy chapter 24 about commanding to give her a certificate and so forth. But anyways, Jesus explains, because of the hardness of your hearts. Well, because people are sinners. And, sometimes they're going to be such awful sinners that it's going to be intolerable to live with them as a husband or as a wife. Some of them, for example, are going to commit adultery. And Jesus said very clearly, according to Matthew, he gave a legitimate reason for divorce. That was adultery. But here's the first thing I want to say that begins to answer the question that was asked. Nobody thought that heard Jesus that day that only adultery was the sole reason, legitimate reason that one could get divorced, because they all knew the law of Moses allowed it for more than that. Okay. Jesus is essentially saying, I'm siding not with Hillel in this decades-long debate, 100-year debate. I'm siding with Shammai. And he said it had to be sexual immorality, and that's what I'm saying. But all of them, Shammai and Hillel, all their followers, all believed there were other legitimate reasons for divorce other than adultery. That was the primary one. But there could be other ones. And if we just stop and think, okay, use the brains that God has given us, we'll come to the conclusion that there have to be other legitimate reasons for divorce other than adultery. I've already mentioned one at the beginning of this little lesson, in that, and it's based on Scripture. Of course, Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman to lust for has already committed adultery in his heart. And so if adultery is a legitimate grounds for divorce, then, here's the question. Is heart adultery legitimate grounds for divorce? And again, I'm not talking about a wife catching her husband one time and him apologizing profusely and promising to do better and maybe stumbling or something. I'm talking about the husband who doesn't care and who is indulging in pornography. He's a habitual adulterer. He's actually a polygamous adulterer, because he's got multiple women he's looking at in his pornography. And I would never, ever counsel a woman to stay in a marriage where her husband is an habitual, unrepentant, practicing mental adulterer who's indulging in pornography. That, and to be honest with you, some folks, and this is such a hot topic, and there's so many nuances and so forth that I know I'm opening a can of worms, and there'll be lots of comments and so forth. But I'm looking at it from a pastoral point of view in light of the entire Bible. Okay. What we know about the character of God, and to take this one statement of Jesus and say, well, this is the sum total of everything that could be said or thought that's a legitimate reason for divorce, I think is a little bit naive. Okay, so let's just say that you're married to someone who is physically abusive and who physically harms you. Let's make it pretty bad, regularly, so that you're bruised and bloody. Now, you're telling me that God would say, well, unless he commits adultery, you have no right to divorce him? Well, there are people who actually, so-called theologians who say that because, oh, we're sticklers for the word. This is what Jesus said. I believe it, and that settles it. Well, listen, let me in closing, because we've gone so long, let me in closing just read you one verse out of Deuteronomy. Jesus gave the law of Moses just as much as Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, okay? And we find in Exodus 21 a law concerning a woman who was a concubine, not even a full-fledged wife, okay? And listen to the rights given to her by the law. If he, that's the husband, takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. So she's going to get just as much food as she got before this other woman entered the picture in a polygamous marriage, just as much clothing and food, and just as much sex. And if he doesn't do that, listen to this, if he will not do these three things for her, then she should go out for nothing without payment of money. Well, if you read the whole context, you'd have a better understanding of what that means. But he doesn't have to refund his bride price to her father. It's basically what that's saying. But she has the right to leave because he's not providing just the basics of what he should provide: food, clothing, and conjugal rights. So when these guys asked Jesus that question, that trying to get him to enter into the debate of the day about what constitutes legitimate reason for divorce, the Hillel and the Shammai debate, and he said, I'm siding with Shammai. It's the indecency of Deuteronomy 24 is sexual immorality. Nobody thought, what you mean is that women who are battered and bruised by their husbands can't get out of their marriage. Nobody thought that. First of all, because they had Exodus 21, the verse I just read, and secondly, because none of them were that stupid, as are some people today who say, well, we're sticklers for the word, and Jesus said the only legitimate reason is adultery, and so that's what Jesus said. Jesus was not changing the law of Moses. He was giving divine commentary on his law, which was the law of Moses. All right? All right. And so, all that being said, I'm certainly not advocating easy divorce. In fact, if a woman was physically abused by her husband, I would recommend that she separate from him and she communicate to him, look, you can't treat me like this and expect me to stay around. And so unless you change and prove that you've changed, this marriage is over. So she's using the leverage that she has. And it also can be considered an act of love towards their own children. And I know that, that's why we try to avoid divorce. Go to great lengths to avoid divorce for the sake of any children of the marriage, because a divorce is going to affect them. But hey, divorce is not just going to affect them. Watching their mother be abused is going to affect them. too. Okay? So God hates divorce. It's never his will, but people are sinners. And I would never fault a woman for separating and then giving her husband an ultimatum who's being physically abused. I would also like that verbal abuse, where it's a continual shouting at her and yelling at her and putting her down and, treating her like some low thing and so forth, and vice versa if it was the other way. But when I was a pastor, I counseled women at times and hear what they put up with, at times. And again, I learned that, there's always two sides to every story. So I'm talking about those cases where I had investigated both sides of the story and talking to women and hearing what they're put up with. And I would say to them, I would never have lasted as long as you have lasted in this marriage. Your desire to try to make this thing work and to give your husband a chance to change and reform and treat you half decently, I would have never given him near the time and mercy that you've given him. You must be half angel. And I've met so many women like that over the years, that the abuse that they have suffered. So the leverage that you have is the threat of divorce. And if he doesn't want you back, if you separate, he says, well, go ahead, I don't want you. Well, there you go. Now you know what he's made up of and so forth. Now, I also strongly recommend marital counseling if both parties will agree to it, because, again, there are always two sides to every story, and an impartial counselor who knows something, spiritually mature, could help. But often I found in these cases, one or the other party won't agree to counseling. And so then what do you have left? Well, all you have left is just your own leverage of the threat of, you're going to lose me and you're going to lose your kids at least half of the time. And is that what you want? Or do you want to try to work this out and learn how to treat somebody? All right. So there's, I guess, more that I could say. I know that there'll be comments where people will denounce me and so forth, and call me all kind of things because I'm giving people a way out of a marriage that miserable marriages, and there's not necessarily adultery, but I think I'm right, obviously. Okay. And, I've been happily married for 42 years, and so I have a wonderful, wonderful wife and a great marriage. But I have, in my days as a pastor, did plenty of marriage counseling, and, again, it's not always the husband's fault. Don't get me wrong. I have counseled men who were, rarely, but I've counseled men to separate from their wives because of the abuse that they were suffering. But I've counseled so many women who, again, I'm always amazed at how their tenacity and how their devotion and what they've endured. And I know I would not have lasted nearly as long as they did. Okay. All right. Well, out of time for today. I've got a lot of more in-depth teaching on divorce and remarriage and so forth. I haven't covered remarriage in this little lesson. On our website, davidservant.com or davidservant.org. Either one of those works. The word David, that's my name, servant. And just go to davidservant.com, type in divorce and remarriage. You'll find different articles I've written over the years on that subject, but hopefully they'll be a blessing to you. Okay? Until next time, may the Lord continue to bless you.